The night settles without announcement. Lamps flicker behind drawn curtains. A breeze slips past rooftops and through trees, brushing against old brick and forgotten signs. Somewhere in the distance, a car door closes. Not with urgency, but with the finality of a story that has already begun. It is in moments like this, unhurried and still, that the hidden pieces of the world seem most willing to speak. There are stories that declare themselves with fire and flash. Headlines designed to stir the senses, scandals built for the morning news. But this is not that kind of story. The tale of the Panama Papers arrived not with shouting, but with silence. It was a collection of details, quiet and deliberate. Financial documents, registration papers, ownership logs, and email threads, scattered like leaves on a long-forgotten trail. What made it powerful was not noise, but the gentle, undeniable outline of a global pattern that had remained unseen for generations. To understand this story, one must be willing to step outside the usual pace of things. Offshore finance, tax havens, and shell companies. These phrases often feel distant, dense, inaccessible. But beneath them is something very human, an age-old instinct to guard one's treasure, to hold something back from the light. In earlier times, it meant burying coins under floorboards or locking valuables inside thick-walled vaults. Today it means forming companies that exist only on paper. It means passing wealth through jurisdictions with soft laws and silent customs. It means building castles, not from stone, but from clauses and contracts. The Panama Papers revealed a glimpse of that world. In 2016, an anonymous source leaked over 11 million documents from a law firm in Panama. The firm, Mossack Fonseca, had quietly facilitated the creation of thousands of offshore entities, mechanisms designed not just to hold wealth, but to obscure it. The documents did not accuse one person or one nation, but instead sketched the contours of a global architecture of secrecy. A world where power could float above borders, hidden behind signatures and seals, quietly immune to the rules that most of us live by. But this story is not new. It reaches back through time, to colonial outposts, to trading ports, to royal treasuries tucked away in neutral banks. It stretches across empires and eras, evolving with the tools of each generation. The leak was not the beginning. It was a candle held to the dark. And for a brief moment, we saw. As you listen, let the pace slow. Let the details arrive gently, as history often does, not as a shout, but as a memory. This is not a tale of villains and heroes, but of decisions made in quiet rooms, and of a world built with careful intention. The Panama Papers are only one chapter in that longer history. Tonight, we begin to unfold it. Long before the world knew the name Mossack Fonseca, before the Panama Papers stirred the stillness of a Sunday evening, there existed an unspoken understanding among the world's powerful that some things were meant to remain out of sight. This wasn't secrecy born from crime or scandal, not always. It was discretion, quiet and habitual, a form of invisibility wrapped in paperwork, polished in mahogany offices, and exchanged with the soft clink of coffee cups rather than whispers behind closed doors. To trace the roots of the Panama Papers, we must begin not in 2016, but much earlier, in the silent corridors of empire and commerce, where wealth first learned how to travel unseen. The instinct to protect fortune from prying hands is as old as civilization itself. Long ago, kings would ship their gold across oceans, hiding it from invaders or rivals. Nobles escaping revolution would send their estates, not on horseback, but in the form of letters of credit to far-off banks. Merchants who feared a downturn or a new tax law would place their profits in the name of a cousin or a friend in another city. It was a form of financial survival, and over time, it evolved into something far more structured. By the early 20th century, that instinct had a new home. Switzerland's banks became known as the world's most discreet. Their vaults were not just for safekeeping valuables, but for sheltering identities. A client could walk in and with the right introductions, deposit a fortune under a number, not a name. During the World Wars, Swiss neutrality attracted not only refugees, but also money from monarchs, exiles, businessmen, and others uncertain about the future. These practices weren't always illicit. Many were simply seeking peace of mind in an age of upheaval. But the structure, the anonymity, the silence, laid a foundation that would inspire an entire offshore industry. Elsewhere, the idea of corporate identity began to shift. In 1919, Panama introduced a system allowing anyone, no matter where they lived, to create a corporation with limited obligations and wide protections. It didn't take long for this legal framework to catch the eye of lawyers and bankers in Europe and North America. Here was a nation, small and strategically placed, offering companies that didn't need to report much, didn't have to operate within Panama's borders, and didn't have to reveal who was really in charge. The idea spread. Jurisdictions large and small began to compete quietly in a new kind of race. The race to attract capital not by strength or size, but by leniency and discretion. The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, Bermuda, the Bahamas, and later Singapore and Dubai, all began crafting laws to appeal to a certain clientele. Some slashed taxes to nothing. Others guaranteed banking secrecy in their constitutions. What they offered wasn't wealth, but the legal machinery to contain it, safely, silently, and far from scrutiny. By the 1970s, this offshore network had matured into a vast archipelago of finance. Lawyers in London could set up a company in the Caribbean with just a few signatures. A businessman in Argentina could protect his family's assets by transferring them to a trust in Liechtenstein. An oil executive in the Middle East could discreetly purchase property in France using a shell company registered in the Seychelles. All of this could be done legally, if carefully. The appeal was universal: flexibility, protection, and above all, privacy. The term offshore began to mean more than geography. It described a state of existence, of wealth that had no clear origin and no obvious home. These weren't necessarily places of palm trees and white sand. Delaware in the United States became a favorite for anonymous company registration. So did Nevada and Wyoming. London itself, through its satellite jurisdictions, played a central role in enabling this system. The great financial capitals weren't just outside the network, they were often its architects. And within this world, certain professions quietly flourished. Law firms, trust companies, and private banks became the stewards of hidden fortunes. They marketed not just services, but silence. Brochures used words like confidential, discreet, tailored solutions. The clients varied: old money, new money, legitimate businesses, and yes, sometimes individuals with something to hide. But the industry did not ask too many questions. Its job was to construct walls, not to judge what they protected. This was the world into which Mossack Fonseca emerged. Founded in 1977 by Jürgen Mossack and Ramon Fonseca, the firm was modest at first, a Panamanian law office offering corporate services. But as the offshore economy grew, so too did their ambitions. They built a network of offices and affiliates in places like the British Virgin Islands, the Seychelles, and Hong Kong. They offered shell companies by the thousands, pre-registered, ready to go, anonymous. For a small fee, you could become the director of a company that held a yacht, a villa, or a bank account. Or better yet, you could hire someone else, a nominee, to do it for you. Your name never had to appear. By the 2000s, Mossack Fonseca had become one of the largest creators of offshore companies in the world. It wasn't unique in what it did. Many firms offered similar services. But it was thorough, expansive, and organized. Its databases, client records, and communications formed a detailed portrait of how offshore wealth moved and multiplied. And then, in 2015, someone copied those records. The source remains anonymous, known only as John Doe. In a message sent to a German newspaper, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, the leaker offered a trove of internal data from Mossack Fonseca, not for money, but in the name of justice. over 11 million files, emails, contracts, bank statements, passports, and more. Enough to expose the inner workings of an industry that had thrived on invisibility. The newspaper partnered with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, and over the next year, a team of more than 300 reporters from 80 countries began sifting through the documents. Quietly, carefully, securely. They weren't chasing gossip. They were reconstructing a map, a detailed atlas of modern secrecy. What they found was not one great scandal, but a million small arrangements. Politicians using shell companies to disguise their assets, celebrities sheltering royalties, corporations avoiding billions in taxes, criminal networks hiding their proceeds behind layers of offshore structure. Some of it was legal, much of it was not. All of it had been hidden, until now. When the story broke in April 2016, it was a moment of rare global resonance. Front pages across the world carried the headlines. Protests erupted. Governments pledged investigations. Some officials resigned. Others went silent. For a brief time, the hidden machinery of wealth became visible, and the world, watching, realized just how much had been designed never to be seen. But even then, the leak was not the whole story. The documents pointed to names and transactions, but the real subject was the system itself. A system built not in one place, but everywhere. A system that did not depend on illegality to function, but on silence. On the assumption that no one would ever trace the paperwork backward. On the belief that laws, if spread thin enough across jurisdictions, could protect anything. What the Panama Papers offered was not just a scandal, it was a mirror. A reflection of how the global financial order truly operates, not in theory, but in practice. It showed how wealth can be made to disappear from public view while remaining entirely intact. It raised questions not just about tax avoidance or corruption, but about fairness, trust, and the architecture of modern power. And so, with that foundation, we begin the deeper story. The rise of offshore wealth, the quiet luxury it supported, the moment it cracked, and the legacy it leaves behind. If you stand on the shores of history and look out across the slow tide of wealth, you will find that its course never moves in straight lines. It drifts, it bends, it retreats before returning, winding through loopholes and legal creeks, carved not by nature, but by policy. From the moment value was born, measured in salt, gold, paper, or digits, there has been a desire to place it somewhere beyond reach, not always to hoard it, and not always to hide it, but simply to shield it from whatever force might take it away. It's tempting to think of this story as new, but the architecture of concealment, the elegant art of quiet finance, is much older than most realize. Long before the term offshore was coined, and long before Panama became shorthand for secrecy, the rich and powerful were building invisible walls around their fortunes. Not through vaults of iron, but through rules, through ambiguity, through distance. Let us begin at a quieter time, in the candlelit courts of Europe, in the counting houses of Renaissance cities, where the language of wealth was first translated into abstraction. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Italian bankers in cities like Florence and Genoa pioneered systems of credit that allowed money to move without being seen. Gold stayed locked in strongboxes, while promissory notes flowed freely, backed by the reputation of men whose signatures were trusted more than kings. These early instruments gave rise to banking as we know it, not just a place to store value, but a method to shape how that value appeared. By the 17th century, Dutch and English merchants had mastered this system. Trading companies issued shares, ports levied duties, and money moved invisibly through colonial circuits. Silver mined in Bolivia passed through Manila, into Canton, across the Indian Ocean, and back to Amsterdam, often without ever touching the hand of its owner. Through each transfer, a portion of profit was preserved in quiet entries in ledgers, buried behind terms like shipping costs or adjustments for delay. Each generation refined this skill, and in time, it became something more than an art. It became a profession. When the Industrial Revolution arrived, it brought with it vast new fortunes and equally vast anxieties. The tycoons of the 19th century were not fools. They had seen monarchs fall, currencies fail, and revolts tear through cities once thought untouchable. They understood that wealth tied too visibly to place could also be taken. So, they began to separate their riches from their names and their names from their countries. They formed holding companies, placed assets in trusts, and stored income in banks headquartered in neutral territories. It was here, in this precise pivot from personal wealth to structured abstraction, that the foundation for the offshore world was quietly poured. Switzerland, by this point, was already a beacon of stability. Its neutrality in European wars and its fiercely protective banking laws made it a favorite destination for both legitimate fortunes and those stained by conflict. In 1934, the Swiss banking law formalized this tradition, criminalizing the disclosure of client identities. A number, not a name, would define an account. A key, not a face, would control it. This wasn't secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was discretion, institutionalized. But Switzerland was only the beginning. Across Europe and its territories, small enclaves began experimenting with legal frameworks designed to attract capital without accountability. Luxembourg introduced favorable tax laws for holding companies. Liechtenstein allowed the formation of family foundations that obscured beneficial ownership. In the Channel Islands, and later the Caribbean, British territories adapted their colonial legal structures to create a new export: privacy. These changes were often presented in technical terms, adjustments to trust law, modifications to tax treaties, but their real purpose was unmistakable. They were invitations, a subtle welcome to those seeking a quieter home for their wealth. Meanwhile, the global economy was transforming. After World War II, a new era of liberalization and growth swept the planet. The Bretton Woods system tied major currencies together, and international trade blossomed. Corporations became transnational, investments flowed across borders, and with that flow came complexity and opportunity. Governments sought to regulate this new order, introducing tax systems designed to capture revenue from multinational profits and private fortunes. But for every rule written in Washington, London, or Paris, there were firms working late into the night in Nassau, Geneva, or Hong Kong, finding the spaces between the lines. The offshore industry was not a hidden rebellion. It was a parallel system, perfectly legal in most cases, and meticulously crafted to remain so. The idea of a tax haven crystallized in this era. These were jurisdictions where laws allowed money to rest lightly, low or zero taxation, flexible incorporation rules, strict banking confidentiality, and, most importantly, no requirement to disclose the real person behind a company or a trust. They were not rogue states. They were part of the global economy's furniture, tucked beneath the table, seldom noticed unless you knew exactly where to look. And then came Panama. A small country carved out of empire and canal politics, Panama had always existed in a kind of geopolitical twilight. It was governed by its own leaders, yet shaped by the interests of others. First Colombia, then the United States, and always the merchants and engineers who needed the passage between oceans to remain open. But in the late 20th century, Panama found another role. Its legal code, based loosely on Swiss and American corporate statutes, included provisions that allowed for the creation of anonymous companies, entities that existed on paper, owned by no one visible, controlled by no one accountable. These were not like ordinary businesses. They had no offices, no staff, no products. What they did have was function, to hold assets, sign contracts, open bank accounts, and move money, all while shielding the identity of those who truly benefited. One firm in particular mastered this craft, Mossack Fonseca. Founded in 1977, The law firm operated quietly for decades. It did not advertise on billboards. Its partners did not appear at conferences. But through an expanding web of agents and subsidiaries, it helped create and manage tens of thousands of offshore entities. Some were used for legitimate purposes, others were not. Mossack Fonseca did not ask too many questions. Their clients included billionaires avoiding inheritance tax, politicians moving money out of reach, celebrities shielding real estate purchases, and corporations shifting profits across borders. For each, the process was streamlined. A lawyer in London might contact an intermediary in Panama. That person would register a new company in the British Virgin Islands. The company's shares would be held by a trust in Liechtenstein. And its bank account, the final resting place of the money, might be opened in Cyprus, Singapore, or New Zealand. In the files, everything looked clean. A director's name, a formation date, an address, often shared by hundreds of other companies. But behind the paperwork was a truth that remained deliberately obscured. Who owned it? Who funded it? Who used it? The answers, by design, were never written down. This system was not unique to Panama. Dozens of firms in dozens of countries offered the same services. But Mossack Fonseca stood out for its reach, its scale, and its quiet confidence. It had tapped into something deeper than legal cleverness. It had understood a need, the need to remain unseen. And so, the offshore world grew, not in secret, but in silence, quietly accepted, tolerated, protected by inertia and by the convenient fiction that what was legal must also be fair. Governments knew, regulators knew, even many journalists knew. But the story was too complex, too distant, too abstract. Offshore finance was not a scandal. It was a background hum, the low, persistent drone of global wealth protecting itself. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that trillions of dollars were held in offshore accounts. This was not all criminal. It was not even mostly criminal, but it was all unreachable, immune to taxation, to redistribution, to scrutiny. The rich were not simply richer. They were structurally untouchable. For ordinary people, this world remained invisible. Their savings sat in banks that asked questions. Their taxes were deducted at source. Their property was registered in their names. They lived inside the system. But for those with means, there was always another layer. A place to go where the rules were written differently or not at all. And yet, for all its reach, this empire of paper had a flaw. It relied on discretion, on loyalty, on silence. If even one node in the network broke its vow, the entire web could be illuminated. And that is exactly what happened. But not yet. First, we must finish understanding the rise. Because this was not just a collection of companies or bank accounts. It was a culture, a belief, a quiet understanding that for those who knew the way, the world was more porous than it seemed. The rise of the offshore world was not built in a rush. It was slow and methodical, carried forward by routine as much as strategy. It didn't need the spotlight. Its strength was in stillness. Its growth was measured not in news cycles, but in filing cabinets and phone calls, in quiet contracts drafted between people who understood discretion as a kind of currency. By the late 1990s, an offshore company could be formed in less time than it took to make a pot of coffee. A client could request incorporation by fax. The paperwork, articles of association, nominee arrangements, mailing addresses, would be pre-filled by a clerk in Panama or the Seychelles. In a few clicks, a legal entity was born. On paper, it was real. In practice, it was a ghost. The firms behind these arrangements had refined the model to a science. Everything was standardized. Shelf companies ready for activation, fake board meetings logged retroactively, directors for hire signing dozens of corporate resolutions each day. One person, paid a modest fee, might appear as the legal manager of 300 companies, each with different owners, purposes, and assets. Their job wasn't to run anything. It was to be a name, a placeholder, a shadow that kept the real person behind the curtain. And the clients? They came from everywhere. There were wealthy individuals from democracies, investors and property developers, heirs to family fortunes, entertainers seeking privacy. There were powerful figures from fragile regimes, military leaders, ministers, and their families, who moved public funds into private shelters, often just before their countries descended into chaos. There were multinational corporations using the offshore world not for secrecy, but for strategy, shifting profits to lower tax jurisdictions, structuring mergers to avoid liability, and isolating risk behind carefully arranged subsidiaries. Everyone had their reasons. Some were defensible, others were deeply troubling, but all used the same doors. And the firms who opened them didn't always ask why. There were banks involved too, major names known around the world. Some had entire divisions dedicated to wealth structuring, offering clients full service packages, company registration, trust formation, legal advice, tax optimization, and anonymous account opening. The bank might never list the true owner of the assets. Instead, it would deal with the trustee or the nominee or the company director. The records would show compliance, but the truth would remain buried. This system worked, not because it was hidden from sight, but because it was ignored. Politicians knew about it. Regulators knew about it. Academics and journalists had written about it for years. But it was always someone else's problem. It was too abstract, too complex, too far removed from daily life to feel urgent. And so, it continued. By the early 2000s, there were millions of offshore companies scattered across the globe. Many of them were dormant. Others held real assets: yachts, apartments, bank accounts, intellectual property, artwork, contracts. Some existed only briefly, created for a single transaction, then dissolved. Others persisted for decades, becoming part of their owner's legacy, passed down like family heirlooms or quietly erased when their purpose was served. The companies themselves were faceless, but the system had a personality. It was calm, unbothered, and efficient, and most of all, it was adaptable. When one jurisdiction changed its laws, another quietly updated its offerings. When regulators cracked down on bearer shares, firms shifted to nominee arrangements. When one bank tightened its onboarding procedures, another loosened them in response. The system was never static. It moved like water, always finding a path through the smallest crack. This adaptability was not just survival. It was evolution. A slow, deliberate shaping of a financial ecology in which visibility was optional and accountability was negotiable. This was not the world of criminal underworlds and illicit handshakes. It was the world of boardrooms and spreadsheets, of lawyers in clean suits, of ministers and monarchs, all playing by a different rulebook, one they often helped write. Panama, in this world, played a unique role. Unlike larger financial centers, it offered something smaller jurisdictions could not: plausible deniability. It had courts, banks, and a functioning legal system. It had treaties and diplomats, but it also had a long tradition of accommodating foreign interests, from canal treaties to banking policies. Its corporate registry was designed for speed and simplicity, and firms like Mossack Fonseca took full advantage. At its peak, Mossack Fonseca operated in more than 40 countries and had links to over 200,000 companies. It didn't just form these companies, it maintained them, renewed them, forwarded mail for them, and in some cases, managed their internal records. The firm had agents in dozens of jurisdictions, each with their own language, legal quirks, and customs. But the process remained the same: a clean interface for messy intent. To outsiders, it might have seemed too vast to be real, but that was the genius of it. There was no single thread to pull. Each company was a thread in its own right, and only the person holding the spool could see the pattern. Some companies were used to buy luxury real estate. Others held shares in businesses or stakes in oil contracts. Some controlled intellectual property, music royalties, trademarks, patents. Others existed purely to open bank accounts. The owner of a company could apply for a debit card, make payments, move money, all without ever revealing their true name. The documents would show the company as the client. The directors would be nominees. The address would be a law firm's mailbox. The paper trail would loop back into itself. For years, this system flourished, not underground, but in plain sight. And while journalists and academics continued to raise alarms, the public saw little impact. After all, how does one feel the absence of tax revenue never collected? How do you measure the cost of a hospital not built, a school not staffed, a public service quietly underfunded? That was the true power of the offshore world. Its damage was diffuse. Its impact was delayed. It didn't crash markets or spark revolutions. It simply drained pressure from the system, redirecting resources upward, invisibly, persistently. And yet, within this structure, there was always the potential for fracture. Because even in the most well-oiled machine, there are vulnerabilities, a misfiled document, a disloyal employee, a server not properly secured. And when a system depends entirely on secrecy, a single breach is all it takes to let the light in. The Panama Papers began not with a bang, but with a conversation. An anonymous source, still unidentified to this day, contacted a German newspaper. They offered documents, not summaries or leaks, but raw files. Terabytes of internal records from Mossack Fonseca, emails, contracts, spreadsheets, passport scans, wire transfers, thousands of identities, tens of thousands of companies, all meticulously archived, inadvertently preserved, and now offered for exposure. It was not just a list of names. It was an X-ray of a system most people never knew existed. But that breach, that unraveling, is a story for the next chapter. Here, we are still on the rise. And it is important to remember that the people who built this system did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as providers of service, protectors of assets, architects of efficiency. The firms wrote the documents, the clients signed them, the banks approved the accounts, the jurisdictions offered the laws, and in this collective agreement of convenience, the system thrived. There were no flashing red lights, no moments of obvious wrongdoing, only millions of decisions, made quietly, across desks and continents, each contributing to a larger architecture, one that redirected wealth away from the eyes of the world. And so it rose, invisible, impenetrable, interwoven into the very fabric of the global economy. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the infrastructure of modern wealth, a system that does not need to be hidden, because it is too complex to be grasped at once. But someone grasped it. Someone opened the door. Someone copied the files. The beginning was never truly a beginning. It was more of a slow gathering, of laws, of needs, of ambitions. Before the great towers of finance ever stretched toward the clouds, before the satellite servers and encrypted emails, there were names. And behind those names, there were trusts. Not the kind built in human hearts, but the legal kind. Cold, quiet things, written in distant offices, unfolded across countries that had no knowledge of the people they served. These early trust agreements became the scaffolding of a new global order, one not written in constitutions or taught in civics, but whispered in the contracts of the ultra-wealthy. By the middle of the 20th century, as the world recovered from the shattering of two wars, capital began to flow again, and with it came questions. Where should the money rest? How should it grow? And perhaps most important, how might it remain invisible? In the shadows of Geneva and the corridors of the City of London, the concept of wealth began to change shape. It no longer needed to be physical nor traceable. It only needed to exist in the right kind of jurisdiction. Some of the earliest modern havens were not tropical. They were banks nestled in alpine valleys, where silence was as valuable as gold. Swiss secrecy, Liechtenstein protections, these became folklore among the elite. And then came the sun-drenched Isles, the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, jurisdictions small in size but vast in utility. They offered what the wealthy sought most, the illusion of absence, an account that led nowhere, a company without a face, a legal presence without a human body. Mossack Fonseca, the Panamanian firm at the heart of the papers, did not invent this system, but it did refine it, with spreadsheets, with software, with multilingual service desks. It brought the old ways of concealment into the modern age, offering the rituals of secrecy at the speed of email. Clients no longer needed to travel. A few documents would suffice. A name here, a nominee there. And suddenly, a new company was born, in a place the client would never visit, serving a purpose they would never admit. In these early decades, the facade remained intact. Regulators rarely asked questions. Governments, eager for foreign investment, looked the other way. And the average citizen, struggling with their own taxes, rarely considered what might be hiding overseas. It was an era of quiet expansion, of normalization. Offshore accounts were not only for arms dealers and despots. They were for real estate developers, for celebrities, for corporations seeking efficiency. Language softened. Terms like tax optimization and asset protection replaced harsher phrases. And as the vocabulary evolved, so did the structure. A new ecosystem took root. Law firms in Panama, nominee directors in Cyprus, accounting advisors in Singapore, banking offices in Jersey and Guernsey, private jet brokers in Dubai, all quietly interconnected. The offshore world became a ghost economy, one that touched the onshore world at every turn, yet left no fingerprints. And slowly, the system began to feed itself. Companies formed other companies. Foundations held other foundations. The trail never ended, because it was never meant to. And behind it all was not a mastermind, but a market. Demand met by supply. It is important to note that not all who used these services were criminals. That would be too simple. Many were merely wealthy. Some were simply cautious. Others were advised by experts who promised it was all legal, all standard, all smart. But legality is not a synonym for justice, and strategy is not the same as morality. This tension between what is allowed and what is right would become the silent heartbeat of the offshore world. In those early decades, enforcement was rare. Investigations took years and led nowhere. Even when suspicious activity was discovered, the jurisdictions involved often lacked the will or the jurisdiction to intervene. What began as a mechanism for hiding from taxes quickly evolved into something more, a global veil behind which corruption, evasion, and exploitation could flourish. It is difficult to trace the exact moment the system passed from creative accounting into moral hazard. There was no single law passed, no summit convened, just a quiet erosion of accountability, spread across borders, protected by formality. This was the rise, not loud, not violent, but steady, and beneath it all, something more human stirred. The belief, held by many who participated, that they were simply playing the game, that the rules were for others, that if the loophole existed, one was justified in using it. This mindset, more than any single document or account, was the real engine behind the Panama Papers. It is a mindset that does not wear a villain's face. It wears a suit, carries a briefcase, smiles in television interviews, sponsors museums, and speaks at economic forums. And so, when we speak of the rise, we must not imagine a castle in the clouds. We must imagine a long hallway of offices, a corridor of folders, a stream of PDFs, the gentle tapping of keyboards, and the hum of compliance software. It was not dramatic, it was procedural. And that is precisely what made it so powerful. Because when something becomes procedure, it ceases to feel like a choice. It becomes routine. By the dawn of the new millennium, the offshore world had become so embedded in global finance that removing it felt unimaginable. Major banks offered offshore products. Corporations structured entire strategies around it. And political donors often routed their gifts through the same jurisdictions. The system was no longer hidden in the shadows. It had simply become part of the architecture. The room no one entered, but everyone knew existed. Yet even as the system matured, cracks began to appear. Scandals emerged. Questions were asked. But without documents, without names, the system remained resilient, anonymous, untouchable, until 2016. But before that moment of rupture, there was still a final stage of the rise, one that took place not in boardrooms or law firms, but in the collective consciousness. The normalization of secrecy. It is one thing for wealth to hide. It is another for the world to accept that it must. This quiet surrender, the belief that the very rich live by different rules, became the final seal around the offshore world. And so the rise was not just logistical, it was psychological, cultural, a soft forgetting, a silent permission. And then came the papers. There is a moment in every empire, financial or otherwise, when the machinery hums without resistance. When the structures built in shadows and loopholes no longer feel experimental or fragile, but established, self-sustaining, and quietly powerful. The offshore world, by the turn of the 21st century, had reached such a moment. It had matured. It had learned how to carry its own weight while remaining invisible to those outside its reach. It did not need to expand by conquest. It needed only to offer the right doors to those with keys. The clients who walked through those doors were not operating in secret basements or behind drawn blinds. They were, in many cases, seated at the highest tables of society. Presidents and prime ministers, royal families, titans of industry, and celebrated figures from the world of art and sport. Not criminals, not overtly, but participants in a financial game where the rules favored those who could afford not to play by them. They did not gather in one place. There was no grand hall of hidden wealth. Instead, their lives intersected in bank records, legal contracts, nominee agreements, and shell companies. Their choices were scattered across continents, yet synchronized in effect. Each move, a real estate purchase through a Virgin Islands company, a luxury yacht registered to a Panamanian corporation, an art collection held by a trust in the Channel Islands, was, on its own, unremarkable. But together, these choices formed a mosaic of global detachment. A lifestyle unanchored by geography, immune to the constraints of citizenship. The lifestyle of those operating at the peak of this offshore network was not necessarily defined by extravagance, though there was no shortage of it. It was defined by insulation. Where others saw borders, they saw pathways. Where governments saw tax obligations, they saw planning opportunities. Where investigators saw obfuscation, they saw discretion. Take, for example, the world of high-end real estate. In cities like London, New York, Dubai, and Paris, luxury properties are not always homes in the traditional sense. They are vaults. Stores of value held not in gold or stocks, but in square footage. Through offshore companies, a buyer could acquire a penthouse in Knightsbridge, or a villa overlooking the Mediterranean, without their name appearing on the title. The property, legally speaking, belonged to a company. The company belonged to a trust. The trust was administered by a law firm, and the law firm, in turn, was bound by confidentiality. It is not illegal to buy property this way, nor is it necessarily unethical. But when layered with intention, when used to conceal politically exposed persons, to shelter proceeds from corruption, or to evade court orders, the moral lines begin to blur. The same structure applied to yachts, private jets, and investment portfolios. A vessel might fly the flag of one country, be registered in another, and be owned by a company based in a third, all while the true beneficiary lived elsewhere entirely. This layering created not only distance, but plausible deniability. If challenged, The response could be simple. I don't own it. Technically, that was true. On paper, they owned nothing, but in practice, they controlled everything. This arrangement was not the product of any single conspiracy. It was a reflection of systemic evolution, a response to incentives. In a world where wealth could move faster than legislation, the wealthiest did not need to break the law. They only needed to follow it more cleverly than it was written. Law firms and financial institutions facilitated this process with practiced ease. A client might approach their advisor not with a crime to conceal, but with a legacy to preserve. How can I protect my assets from litigation? How can I pass wealth to my heirs without taxation? How can I diversify risk across jurisdictions? The answers came in binders, in flowcharts, in PowerPoint slides prepared in private offices. Establish a holding company in Belize. Have that company create a trust in Guernsey. Appoint nominee directors. Open bank accounts in Zurich. Ensure that all communications go through intermediaries. And most importantly, never sign anything in your own name unless absolutely necessary. This was not exotic. It was mundane. Wealth structuring became a service as standardized as insurance or estate planning. And for the clients at the highest levels of global wealth, it was not optional. It was expected. At this stage, Mossack Fonseca and firms like it no longer needed to sell secrecy. They sold continuity. Their role was not to hide wrongdoing, but to maintain the smooth functioning of lifestyles built on untraceable assets. They were enablers of invisibility, not in the criminal sense, but in the architectural sense. They provided the blueprints. They handled the maintenance. The clients simply lived their lives untouched. Among the names later revealed in the Panama Papers were not just obscure businessmen or anonymous bureaucrats. They included prime ministers, close associates of presidents, oligarchs, and celebrities. Some of these individuals had committed no crimes. Others had carefully skirted the edge of legality. Still others had crossed it long ago and found refuge in the structures that the offshore world offered. But the effect was the same, a system that concentrated privilege, protected wealth, and removed accountability. A system in which the consequences of global inequality were not addressed, but simply bypassed. It was not just individuals who benefited. Corporations also refined their use of offshore entities during this period. By routing intellectual property through low-tax jurisdictions, they could shift vast profits away from where goods were sold and into places where taxes were minimal or non-existent. A brand might develop in California, sell in Europe, and book its profits in Bermuda. Through complex arrangements, known as transfer pricing and double Irish with a Dutch sandwich, multinationals could legally reduce their tax burdens to single digits, even as their revenues soared. Again, this was not hidden. In many cases, it was disclosed in earnings reports. But the mechanics were so complex and the laws so fragmented across borders that enforcement was nearly impossible. Governments complained. Academics protested. Yet little changed. The offshore system was simply too useful, too entrenched, too international to reform with domestic legislation alone. And so, the peak continued. The lifestyle that emerged from this structure was not merely luxurious. It was frictionless. Assets were shielded from lawsuits, from ex-spouses, from hostile regimes, from downturns. A scandal in one country need not affect a fortune held in another. A court order could be delayed, deflected, or rendered moot by the sheer complexity of the ownership chain. The same wealth that could not be taxed often could not be reached, even by those with legitimate claims. Privacy in this sense became more than a preference. It became a defense mechanism, and the offshore world, at its peak, offered privacy not as a luxury good, but as a baseline service for those who could pay. What made this moment so distinct, this crest of the offshore system, was that it no longer had to justify itself. Its presence was assumed, its logic internal. Entire economies had begun to rely on the industry. In jurisdictions where offshore finance was a pillar of GDP, local governments had no incentive to restrict it. Lawyers, bankers, administrators, and public officials depended on the flow of registrations and renewals. The system sustained livelihoods. It built office towers and paid for education. It was a quiet engine of modern finance, seldom praised, seldom punished, simply enduring. In cities like Panama City, Georgetown, and Road Town, sleek office buildings rose near the water's edge, their windows tinted against the sun. Inside, clerks filed paperwork. Phones rang softly. Bankers greeted clients by appointment. There were no alarms, no locked briefcases, no smoke-filled rooms, just air conditioning, polished floors, and a quiet hum of documents in motion. And above it all, the illusion of distance. For those on the outside, the offshore world remained abstract. A rumor, a suspicion, a line item. But for those on the inside, it was a daily rhythm. The world did not look secretive. It looked normal. Yet there was a tension beneath the surface, an unease that came not from fear of exposure, but from the awareness that something this carefully built could still be broken, not by a law or a regulation, but by a leak. This tension would not stop the system from functioning, but it would eventually bring its peak into focus. The lifestyle created by the offshore world was never simply about avoiding taxes or moving money. It was about designing an alternate reality, one where exposure could be sidestepped, where power could flow without friction, and where consequence, if it ever arrived, did so with a gentle knock instead of a bang. For the wealthy families that had used these structures for generations, this was not subversion, it was preservation. They had watched how nations rise and fall, how currencies lose value overnight, how fortunes, if unguarded, can be swallowed by politics or inheritance battles or nationalizations. The offshore world offered them a shield, not absolute, but sturdy. It is said that the richest people in the world do not worry about income, they worry about control. And in this system, control was everything. You didn't need to own the asset directly, you only needed to control the entity that held it. And that control could be structured in so many elegant ways: discretionary trusts, nominee shareholders, bearer instruments, layered holding companies, special purpose vehicles, control without ownership, power without footprint. That was the peak. It wasn't just the billionaires, it was the mid-level political families with quiet ambition, the hedge fund manager with 3 passports and no fixed address, the film producer who hadn't paid taxes in his home country for a decade, not because he evaded anything, but because everything he earned was legally routed through another jurisdiction. These people weren't hiding. They were simply living in a financial stratosphere most of the world never glimpsed. And yet, the decisions they made had ripple effects. When a luxury tower in London is bought entirely through shell companies, local housing prices respond. When major corporations move their taxable income to zero-tax jurisdictions, governments must cut public spending or raise taxes elsewhere. When billions of dollars in state revenue are siphoned offshore through illicit contracts and fraudulent tenders, the citizens of those countries lose out on infrastructure, education, healthcare. It is not that every participant in the offshore system intended harm, but harm followed anyway. Wealth is not neutral. When concentrated, it distorts. When shielded, it undermines accountability. And when praised as cleverness instead of questioned as extraction, it becomes the quiet engine of inequality. At the height of the offshore era, these truths remained distant, discussed in academic journals, occasionally covered by niche media outlets, but rarely felt viscerally by the average person. The system was simply too opaque, too indirect, until the leak. The Panama Papers did not just reveal the names of people using offshore structures. They revealed the banality of the system, the casual language in emails, the templates reused across clients, the bureaucratic tone of secrecy. It was not cinematic, it was administrative. A request might come in from a banker in Switzerland. We need a vehicle for a politically exposed client. The firm would respond with options. We can offer you an aged company in the BVI with nominee directors. We can also arrange a mail forwarding service and power of attorney. The conversation would continue, cleanly. No raised flags, no suspicions, only efficiency. In the files were scanned passports of family members of presidents, contracts that routed payments for mining rights through multiple jurisdictions, memos that explained how to answer questions from regulators, how to redact names, how to delay inquiries. None of this was accidental. It was a culture. One built slowly, over decades, by professionals who saw their role not as accomplices, but as facilitators. The peak was not defined by a single scandal, but by a collective architecture. Mossack Fonseca was merely a prominent example. There were dozens of similar firms, in Panama, in Cyprus, in Singapore, in the Cayman Islands, all offering the same services, all working with the same banks, all responding to the same incentives. There was no central conspiracy, just a shared fluency in obfuscation. What made the Panama Papers so powerful was not that they uncovered a crime. It was that they exposed a world that had long functioned with impunity. A world that was neither illegal nor fully legitimate. A world that had adapted so well to its environment that it had become part of the landscape until someone switched on the lights. Even after the leak, many of the practices continued. Some firms rebranded. Some jurisdictions adjusted their laws, closing certain loopholes while opening new ones elsewhere. Clients moved to newer firms with more encrypted servers and more specialized agents. But the illusion of permanence was shaken. Those living at the peak had long believed in the stability of the system. They believed that complexity protected them. That distance from the asset meant distance from responsibility. That because the system had worked yesterday, it would work tomorrow. The Panama Papers reminded them that all it takes is one leak, one source, one breach of trust, and decades of architecture can be mapped and published and pored over by journalists, regulators, and the public. It was not a total collapse, but it was a reckoning. In the quiet offices where documents had once been stamped and faxed and filed away, phones rang with a new tension. Clients asked questions. What exposure do I have? Are my entities listed? Do we need to wind things down? Firms reassured them. We are not mentioned in the leak. Your name is not in the documents. Everything remains confidential. But the confidence was gone, and something else had begun to take its place. Not panic, but recognition. That the system, for all its elegance, had limits, and that perhaps the peak had passed. The Panama Papers revealed more than names. They revealed how normalized secrecy had become, how routine avoidance had become, how dull even the machinery of offshoring could be when laid bare. There were no Bond villains, no dramatic meetings on yachts, just clerks, just templates, just process. And that may have been the most troubling part. For the average person, reading the stories, it was not the extravagance that shocked them. It was the ease. The idea that, with the right money and the right connections, you could live in a different financial reality. Not above the law, just outside its line of sight. At its peak, the offshore world offered this alternate reality to tens of thousands of people. They did not all abuse it, but they all benefited from its discretion. As the Panama Papers spread through headlines and newsrooms, as politicians scrambled to issue statements and deny wrongdoing, as compliance teams reviewed their records and journalists pieced together networks of ownership, one thing became clear. The system was no longer invisible. Its power, once hidden in silence, had become visible in volume. At the height of its operation, Mossack Fonseca was not a mere law firm. It was an architect of invisibility. Its founders did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as facilitators of privacy. They wore suits, attended lectures, gave interviews. Their names appeared on firm brochures, not wanted lists. Within their offices, the routine was clinical. Clients submitted requests through intermediaries, never directly. There were forms to sign, names to assign, shells to create. The process was streamlined, efficient. Companies were born in minutes and with them, a new legal identity that bore no real reflection of its controller. For the client, it meant more than savings. It meant shelter. From taxes, from creditors, from scrutiny. It was, in a word, safety. Not from crime, but from consequence. By the 2000s, this system reached its aesthetic peak. Luxury apartments in London, owned by companies based in the Caribbean. Artworks that moved from port to port, their ownership hidden in vaults of legal jargon. Yachts bearing the flags of countries the owner never visited. Aircraft registered under holding firms whose trail twisted through Malta, then Cyprus, then Panama. To those who participated, this was not deception. It was sophistication. In the wealthiest circles, owning nothing and controlling everything became a mark of intelligence. Discretion was praised. Visibility was a liability. To appear on a public registry was seen as a failure of planning. And so, the greatest luxury was not possession. It was erasure. Some spent tens of thousands, even millions, to ensure their names would never appear beside their assets. For them, privacy was priceless, not because they were hiding crimes, but because they had learned that in a world of growing instability, the safest place to stand was behind a curtain. But the curtain itself became an industry. Behind every anonymous company was a web of enablers. Accountants who certified the legitimacy of the structure. Lawyers who blessed the paperwork. Banks who nodded the transfers through. Registries who asked no questions. And governments who provided the legal scaffolding. This was not a rogue enterprise. It was institutional. And for many years, it thrived. Celebrities, politicians, corporate titans, royal families. The cast was diverse, but the script remained the same. Use the structure, shield the identity, separate the self from the money. And should anyone ask questions, point to the legality. After all, the structure had become global. Why shouldn't one participate in it? But beneath the polished marble of offices and private homes, a quieter unease had begun to stir. The same mechanisms used by the elite to avoid taxes were also being used by others. Traffickers, war profiteers, dictators. The boundary between protection and collusion became harder to define. A company used to purchase a vineyard in France might also be used to smuggle arms into a conflict zone. A foundation designed to preserve family wealth might also serve to move bribes between accounts. The system did not discriminate. It served those who could afford its services. And so, as the offshore empire reached its peak, it also began to drift towards something darker. Some clients no longer sought only tax reduction. They sought full disconnection. They wanted accounts that could never be traced, transfers that would leave no echo, ownership structures that no court could unravel. And the firms, in their competition for clients, often obliged. The complexity increased. Layer upon layer of company, trust, and nominee was stacked like bricks in a fortress. And with each additional wall, accountability grew fainter. The financial centers of the world, once beacons of transparency, became complicit through silence. They allowed foreign capital to flow in, no questions asked. Entire neighborhoods in global cities were purchased by legal ghosts, and while some governments passed new rules, others opened new doors. The race to attract foreign wealth outweighed the desire for transparency. Laws were written in vague terms. Enforcement agencies were underfunded, and a culture of willful ignorance blossomed in the boardrooms of financial institutions. Those on the inside knew the dance. They knew what to avoid, what phrases to use, which flags to fly. It was a choreography of concealment, and it was taught, practiced, and rewarded. This was the zenith, a world where wealth did not shout. It whispered, where the most powerful did not appear in public. They appeared only in influence. Their names were not on documents, only their desires. And yet, there was a fragility beneath it all, a quiet dependence on no one pulling the thread, on no one seeing the full picture, on no one asking the one question that broke the illusion. Who really owns this? That question had become dangerous. It was impolite, even taboo. Journalists who asked were sued. Investigators who probed were redirected, and ordinary citizens were told they would never understand the complexity. But the truth was not that complex. It was this: power had found a way to hide in plain sight. And by doing so, it had redrawn the map of accountability. Nations could no longer tax their richest residents properly. Laws could no longer touch those who lived above them. And economies could no longer function fairly, because the rules were not applied equally. But still, the lifestyle thrived. Private schools, art fairs, global conferences, think tanks funded by anonymous foundations, political donations routed through complex chains. The wealth was not only maintained, it was celebrated. Until one day, a breach occurred, not in the structure, but in the silence. It did not begin with thunder. It began with a message, a voice, anonymous, careful, persistent, and with that voice came the files. But before the breach, before the headlines and arrests, the resignations and denials, there was this moment in time, a moment when the system stood untouched, when its towers of secrecy gleamed in the light, when those who lived behind its walls believed the walls would never fall. Here comes more conflicts. The first cracks rarely make a sound. They do not announce themselves with fury or fire. They arrive quietly, through a whisper, a question, a folder passed in silence. And yet, those cracks carry within them the potential to shake empires. It was late in 2014 when a leak began to drip from the digital vaults of Mossack Fonseca, one of the world's most prolific creators of offshore entities. The firm had operated with clinical efficiency for decades, serving clients across continents. Its methods were not secret. Its services were not rare. What made it vulnerable was something far less dramatic: a failure in its digital defenses, a weak point in the walls that held back years of correspondence, contracts, scans, and spreadsheets. Somewhere, the identity remains uncertain to this day. Someone began collecting those files. Not a handful, not hundreds, but millions. A total of over 11.5 million documents, spanning 4 decades of corporate structuring, nominee arrangements, tax avoidance strategies, and client records. Emails and internal memos, photocopies of passports, spreadsheets showing the movement of funds, contracts signed in haste, and others carefully worded to thread the needle between legality and plausible deniability. At first, the leak was invisible. The world moved on, unaware that a vast archive of the global elite's financial maneuvering was slowly being gathered, sorted, and prepared for exposure. The documents found their way to a German newspaper, Süddeutsche Zeitung. From there, they were shared with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. What followed was not a hasty exposé. It was a slow, methodical unraveling. For over a year, journalists across more than 80 countries worked in silence, analyzing the data, tracing ownership, comparing notes. They created databases, shared findings across encrypted channels, and followed trails that led from nondescript firms in Panama to luxury, properties in Monaco, bank accounts in Singapore, and political power circles in Moscow, Riyadh, and beyond. It was not a bombshell, it was a time bomb. And in April 2016, it finally went off. The stories emerged with the weight of years behind them. In Iceland, Prime Minister Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson faced immediate protest when it was revealed that he and his wife had undisclosed interests in an offshore company holding millions in Icelandic bank bonds. The streets of Reykjavik filled with demonstrators. A resignation soon followed. In Pakistan, the family of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was linked to London real estate held through offshore companies. Though he denied wrongdoing, the revelations led to a court case, public outrage, and his eventual disqualification from office. In Argentina, the newly elected president Mauricio Macri was named as a director of an offshore firm in the Bahamas. He claimed transparency. But questions lingered. And in Russia, while Vladimir Putin's name did not appear directly, the leaks revealed a close friend, a shellist, who had moved billions through offshore channels connected to state-linked entities. The implications were clear, even if the denials were swift. Each revelation landed with different weight in different countries. Some prompted resignations. Others prompted shrugs. The offshore world, it seemed, was so deeply embedded in the machinery of modern governance that exposure did not always lead to accountability. In some places, it simply confirmed what people already believed, that there were two sets of rules, one for those with wealth and access, and one for everyone else. But beyond the headlines was a quieter collapse. Within Mossack Fonseca itself, panic replaced precision. Clients flooded the firm with urgent messages. Am I in the leak? What do I need to do? How much exposure do I have? The firm's lawyers scrambled to reassure them, even as internal systems buckled under scrutiny. The partners, Ramon Fonseca and Jürgen Mossack, faced questions from authorities, journalists, and their own employees. What had been built over decades, with meticulous care and ruthless efficiency, was now unraveling, not through regulation or reform, but through transparency. The firm denied wrongdoing. It insisted that it had always operated within the law, that its clients were responsible for their own actions, that it had merely provided administrative services. But the world, for a moment, saw through the veil. What collapsed was not just a company. It was a sense of impunity. Governments began issuing statements. Some promised investigations. Others opened inquiries. A few scrambled to pass new regulations. Transparency advocates used the moment to push for beneficial ownership registries, public databases, whistleblower protections. But the response was uneven. Offshore structures were not confined to one jurisdiction. Reform in one country could be rendered moot by inaction in another. And many of the jurisdictions most deeply embedded in the offshore economy were unwilling to sacrifice their economic model for the sake of reform. Yet something had changed. Before the Panama Papers, the offshore world had operated under a cloud of plausible ignorance. After, it could no longer claim invisibility. For those who had built careers on secrecy, the lawyers, bankers, and administrators, the landscape shifted. Some firms lost clients. Others doubled down, promising tighter security and more discreet arrangements. A few rebranded entirely, hoping to shed the stigma. The collapse, then, was not total, but it was deep. It exposed corruption not as an act of theft, but as a process of redirection. Public resources quietly siphoned into private coffers, often with the help of accountants and advisors. It exposed how legal systems could be gamed not through defiance, but through compliance, where the letter of the law became a map for avoidance. Perhaps most damning, it exposed how normalized these behaviors had become. To be a head of state, a billionaire CEO, or a royal heir and to own nothing in your own name had become not suspicious but standard. A feature of modern wealth, not a flaw. The collapse that followed the Panama Papers was not just institutional, it was ethical. It forced a reckoning, however brief, with the architecture of global finance. A realization that what many had suspected was, in fact, true. That the rich lived in a parallel system, not because they broke laws, but because they helped write the ones they later used. The days following the Panama Papers release were filled with a nervous quiet. In financial centers, in law offices, in government corridors, there was no mass exodus, no thunderous reckoning. But behind closed doors, eyes scanned spreadsheets, legal teams reviewed exposure, and executives scheduled meetings in private rooms, far from the ears of the press. For many of those implicated, the first concern was not justice. It was damage control. What could be explained? What needed to be denied? What technicalities could be invoked? The language of public relations became a shield, and the language of law a sword. Completely legal, wholly compliant, common industry practice. These were the phrases most often repeated. They were not untrue, but they were not the whole truth, because legality, as the leak revealed, is not synonymous with fairness, and compliance is not the same as integrity. What the Panama Papers exposed was not a criminal underworld, but an alternate world, one that operated by its own logic, hidden in plain sight, fortified by paperwork and polite indifference. The consequences unfolded slowly. In some countries, investigations were launched, committees were formed, pledges were made, transparency registers were proposed, debated, delayed. A few arrests were made, not of presidents or billionaires, but of intermediaries. In some cases, whistleblowers themselves faced greater legal peril than those they exposed. Mossack Fonseca, the firm at the heart of the leak, struggled to stay afloat. Its offices were raided, clients vanished. The two founders, Fonseca and Mossack, were eventually arrested in Panama on charges related to a separate corruption scandal. The firm announced its closure in 2018, but the system itself, the global offshore industry, did not collapse. The countries most dependent on offshore finance, like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and Panama, implemented modest reforms. But their core offerings, low taxation, flexible incorporation laws, and strict confidentiality, remained intact. In truth, they could not afford to change too much. Their economies had grown around these services like coral around a reef. In the aftermath, the offshore industry learned a lesson: not to become more honest, but more secure. Encrypted servers, legal firewalls, and stricter vetting of clients became the new norms. Not for ethical reasons, but for self-preservation. And so the world returned to its rhythm. New stories emerged. The Panama Papers faded from the headlines. But something lingered. For millions who had never known the full scale of the offshore world, the leak opened a curtain. It revealed how systems designed to shelter wealth had also sheltered power, corruption, and inequality. It showed how rules could be written in one country and ignored in another. And it highlighted the strange silence of accountability, how those most visibly implicated seemed least affected. In some corners, the revelations sparked anger. In others, resignation. Many ordinary citizens looked around and saw rising taxes, stagnant wages, crumbling infrastructure, and then learned that their leaders and celebrities had been parking fortunes in offshore trusts, that their own tax burdens helped sustain governments whose officials quietly funneled wealth into private accounts, that the system did not fail. It worked exactly as intended, just not for everyone. This realization was corrosive. It undermined faith in institutions, it deepened cynicism, and it fueled a growing suspicion that no matter how damning the evidence, power would protect itself. Still, there were small victories. Some countries did enact beneficial ownership registries, making it harder for companies to hide their true owners. Some whistleblowers were protected. Some journalists were honored for their courage. And some firms began to fear the next leak, the next Panama, the next Pandora. But the broader structure remained, because it was never just about one law firm or one set of clients. It was about an entire architecture of financial invisibility, one that spanned jurisdictions, languages, professions, and political systems. One that had been built not in defiance of the law, but in mastery of it. What the Panama Papers revealed in the end was not a breach of rules, but a different set of rules entirely. The collapse was partial, the conflict ongoing. In the years since the leak, new revelations have surfaced, new papers, new exposés, new outrages. But each time, the arc has been the same. A flash of truth, a flurry of headlines, a wave of outrage, and then stillness. It is not that the world does not care. It is that the machinery remains, and the machinery does not break from shame. What does collapse over time is trust. trust in governments to act in good faith, trust in markets to reward merit, trust in law to protect the many, not just the few. That is the deeper corrosion. The one that leaves no arrest record, but hollows the heart of democratic institutions. The one that whispers, there is no fairness, only access. The conflict then is not just between rich and poor, legal and illegal, foreign and domestic. It is between two visions of society, one where rules apply universally, and one where they apply selectively, based on wealth, proximity, and discretion. The Panama Papers forced that conflict into the open, and while many tried to walk around it, to wait for the noise to fade, it remains. A scar, a question, a quiet revolt. What unraveled in the wake of the Panama Papers leak was not merely a legal or political event. It was an unmasking of a system that had long traded on the illusion of opacity. The public, for the first time, was handed the raw texture of global corruption, not as rumor or broad speculation, but as scanned signatures, internal emails, and certified formation documents. It was not simply the scale of the leak that staggered observers. It was its specificity. This was not a story told through headlines or summarized in figures. This was the anatomy of concealment laid bare. Yet even with this rare access to the truth, accountability proved difficult to anchor. For every official who stepped down or answered to a court, there were dozens whose names were buried in deeper structures, whose intermediaries had taken care to fragment the trail just enough. Investigations launched quickly, but the machinery required to prosecute cases of such international reach was slow, complicated, and often politically obstructed. The truth could travel, but justice remained restricted by jurisdiction. In some countries, the revelations landed like a hammer. In Iceland, the Prime Minister's name appeared in the data. Public outrage was immediate and sustained. Protests filled the streets, and within days, resignation followed. In Pakistan, the papers named relatives of then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Legal proceedings would stretch on for months, eventually leading to his disqualification from office. In these moments, it appeared as though something fundamental had shifted, that exposure might finally drag consequence into the light. But in many cases, that initial flash of reckoning was followed by a long, dull silence. The structures persisted. Some firms changed names, others merged, and many adapted. The financial world, after decades of normalization, had developed antibodies to scandal. As long as there was plausible deniability and the right paperwork in place, most continued to operate as they had before, perhaps more quietly, but hardly more ethically. The international institutions tasked with addressing systemic abuse faced their own limits. Tax justice advocates called for stronger beneficial ownership registries, but these were met with uneven implementation. In some jurisdictions, reforms were promised and never delivered. In others, they were built but rendered toothless by loopholes. The nature of offshore finance meant that one weak link in a global chain could compromise the whole, and many links remained purposefully fragile. Meanwhile, those who dared to trace the implications of the leak found themselves navigating new risks. Journalists, though initially praised for their courage, were not universally protected. Some faced lawsuits, others received threats. In Malta, journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was investigating financial secrecy connected to the leak and other corruption cases, was assassinated by a car bomb in 2017. Her death sent a chilling message. Exposure might still carry a price too few were willing to pay. And so, the question that haunted the post-leak world was not simply what will be done, but what can be done. The architecture exposed by the Panama Papers had become so deeply interwoven with the global economy that to remove it entirely would require not just policy shifts, but a reimagining of what wealth means, where it resides, and to whom it must answer. For many, the lesson was clear. The world does not lack information. It lacks enforcement. It lacks collective will. And most of all, it lacks a system that treats opacity as a defect rather than a service. The Panama Papers did not collapse the financial secrecy industry, but they did fracture its myth. The idea that what happens offshore is unknowable, inaccessible, and beyond the reach of ordinary people. More importantly, they revealed the asymmetry at the heart of global finance. For the majority of people, rules are fixed and consequences immediate. For the powerful, rules are pliable and enforcement is often negotiated. That divide, long sensed but rarely illustrated, became concrete, documented, searchable, named. Still, the papers left something else in their wake: a network of informed citizens, watchdogs, reformers, and whistleblowers who would continue the work. The ICIJ, emboldened by the visibility of the leak, expanded its collaborations and refined its methods. Journalists around the world began building new models for secure data handling. Activists pushed for digital tools that could map shell company ownership in real time. These were quiet victories, perhaps, but victories nonetheless. And for a brief moment, even the most fortified among the wealthy had to look over their shoulder, not because their secrets were leaked, but because it had been proven that such secrets could be, that the vault was not impenetrable, that silence could break, that somewhere, someone inside might still believe in a greater public good. What the Panama Papers ultimately offered was not a solution, but a mirror. A long, uncomfortable gaze into the machinery of power, money, and invisibility. And while mirrors cannot enforce justice, they can reveal imbalance, they can start conversations, they can shift narratives, and they can remind us that behind every anonymous company, every sterile formation document, and every offshore account lies a series of choices, some legal, others merely tolerated, all significant. In the years that followed, new leaks would emerge. The Paradise Papers, the Pandora Papers, each building on the last, each illuminating different corridors of the same vast house. And with each new release, the public vocabulary evolved. No longer was offshore merely the language of tax planning. It had become the vocabulary of global power, and with it, the echo of its abuses. The Panama Papers were not the end of secrecy, nor the death of corruption, but they were a rupture in a long, controlled silence. And in that rupture, something enduring was planted: the knowledge that power, even when hidden, leaves behind a trace. Somewhere in the middle of this sprawling structure of trusts and transfers, within the endless maze of nominee shareholders and electronic filings, lies the answer to a deeper question. Not how the rich hide their fortunes, but why they must. And perhaps, more quietly still, what happens when they no longer can. The noise of scandal fades. Headlines vanish. Protests thin out. But history, when it changes, does not always change loudly. Sometimes it shifts in silence. The Panama Papers marked one of those moments. What began as a crack in secrecy became a shadow stretching across the world's financial conscience. The storm had passed. Names had been named. Firms had fallen. But the legacy was still forming. Not in a courtroom or news cycle, but in boardrooms, in law schools, in hushed meetings between regulators and lobbyists, in the daily calculations of those who once operated with impunity, and perhaps most profoundly in the minds of ordinary people who had seen something they were never supposed to see. This was not simply a case of fraud exposed or corruption punished. It was something more elusive, a collective glimpse into a parallel system that had always been there, behind mirrored glass. The shock came not from the size of the fortune sheltered offshore, but from the ease with which it had been done, and for so long. The legacy began to take shape, not in the centers of power, but in the margins. In Ecuador, after the leak, then-President Rafael Correa proposed a referendum that would bar elected officials from holding assets in tax havens. The country voted yes. In the United Kingdom, a new registry of beneficial ownership was announced, requiring companies to disclose their true owners. It was a move long resisted, suddenly made possible by the momentum of outrage. In the European Union, conversations gained speed about tightening anti-money laundering rules and increasing information sharing between states. Words that had once felt abstract, transparency, accountability, equity, began to find their way into draft laws, committee reports, and parliamentary speeches. But progress was uneven. For every nation that acted, another delayed. For every reform passed, others were quietly watered down. Lobbyists worked long hours, definitions were narrowed, deadlines were pushed, exceptions were made. Still, the conversation had changed. The term beneficial owner was no longer confined to tax attorneys. The phrase shell company began to enter the public lexicon. People who had never thought of Panama beyond its canal now knew it as a symbol, not of geography, but of secrecy. Loss, too, came in less visible forms. For Mossack Fonseca, the loss was existential. Offices shuttered, emails stopped, phones went unanswered. The partners faded from public view, their names etched forever into the digital record as architects of a broken system. For clients, some guilty, others merely cautious, there was loss of control, loss of anonymity, a sudden vulnerability. Many began to restructure their holdings. Some moved to new jurisdictions, others divested. But the leak remained, an archive beyond their reach, downloaded by journalists, regulators, archivists, and activists around the world. For institutions that had facilitated the system, banks, accounting firms, legal practices, there was reputational loss, not always terminal, but staining. Some faced fines, others lost licenses, but most carried on, their practices slightly altered, their processes more discreet, their language more coded. And yet, there was another kind of loss, one harder to measure. A loss of faith. Faith in the story that the rules were fair, that merit determined wealth, that democracy could not be bought, that law meant justice. The Panama Papers did not destroy these beliefs, but they eroded them, gently, persistently. This erosion took form in the silence of the aftermath. In the months that followed the leak, the absence of meaningful consequences became, itself, a kind of consequence. The public had witnessed the architecture of avoidance. They had seen how leaders, celebrities, and corporations moved money through a latticework of trusts and nominees and mailbox companies. They had read the emails, scanned the charts, and seen the passport scans. And then, for many of those named, nothing happened. A few resigned. Fewer were charged, most simply continued. This silence spoke volumes. And in that silence, people began to question not just the individuals exposed, but the structure that made their actions legal. They began to see how law too can be bent, not by breaking it, but by mastering it. For those in power, this was dangerous. Trust, once fractured, is not easily repaired. Institutions that fail to protect the public from exploitation do not lose their authority overnight. They lose it slowly, in increments, as people disengage, disbelieve, and drift. This is how empires weaken, not always through rebellion, but through retreat. The haunting aftermath of the Panama Papers is found in that retreat, in the widening gap between legality and legitimacy, in the recognition that wealth, when it escapes scrutiny, reshapes society in its image. A haunting truth lingered in the documents, that secrecy, once established, does not dissolve with exposure. It mutates, it adapts. Indeed, the offshore industry did not end, it moved. New jurisdictions rose to replace the ones embarrassed. New firms took on the clients of those disgraced. New strategies replaced the old. The system, like water, found new paths to flow. And yet something fundamental had changed. No longer could practitioners of the offshore craft rely on silence. They now worked under the weight of precedent, the knowledge that one leak could undo years of discretion, that a single breach could open a door that would not easily close. This awareness slowed some, it hardened others. It brought about a cautious evolution, not reform, but refinement. The Panama Papers became a cautionary tale, not for governments, but for the wealthy. Encrypt your servers. Review your compliance. Vet your intermediaries. Prepare your denials. The haunting aftermath then was this. The system survived, but it was forced to see itself. There are moments in history when exposure leads to revolution. And there are moments when exposure leads only to recognition. A brief glimpse in the mirror before the light dims again. The legacy of the Panama Papers lies somewhere between the two. Not a reckoning, not a revolution, but a reckoning postponed. And still, the story was not over. The shadows cast by the leak began to stretch into the next decade, influencing how new investigations unfolded, how new policies were framed, and how the public responded to future scandals. The Pandora Papers, the Paradise Papers, the FinCEN files, each followed, each echoed, but none existed without the first great breach, the one that tore through the heart of silence and reminded the world that even the most secure systems are vulnerable to truth. As the fog of the initial scandal lifted, those who had helped expose the Panama Papers found themselves on a different kind of journey, one not defined by drama, but by endurance. The legacy of the papers was not contained in one headline or court case. It was scattered, like ash across continents, settling into the workflows of lawyers, the classrooms of policy students, and the memories of those who realized they had been looking at the world through a half-closed window. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, the quiet engine behind the publication, did not rest. In the months and years that followed, they became the torchbearers of a new age of investigative collaboration. No longer working in silos, no longer bound by borders, they demonstrated what could happen when information flowed freely, not just among elites, but among those tasked with uncovering them. They created databases, publicly accessible, searchable, translated. For the first time in modern history, the tools of deep financial investigation, once reserved for auditors and prosecutors, were handed to anyone with curiosity and time. Teachers assigned students to trace ownership chains. Journalists in small-town newsrooms dug into connections their countries had previously overlooked. Activists found leverage. It wasn't loud, but it was there. Still, resistance came quickly. From the very beginning, powerful voices pushed back. Some cast doubt on the whistleblower's intentions. Others argued that privacy, not secrecy, was under attack. Lawsuits were filed. Threats were made. One journalist, Daphne Caruana Galizia, who had been investigating Maltese connections to the papers, was assassinated by a car bomb in 2017. The echo of her death still lingers in the halls of Europe. What the Panama Papers revealed was not just a network of money. It was a network of vulnerability. A journalist might be silenced, a firm might be dissolved, but the architecture remained. And still, amid the shadows, change flickered. A growing number of countries began implementing automatic exchange of tax information. The OECD's Common Reporting Standard, once a theoretical ideal, began to take shape in real policy. Banking secrecy in places like Switzerland, once invincible, began to soften. International pressure mounted. Blacklists of tax havens were proposed. Grey lists followed. Some jurisdictions made cosmetic reforms. Others genuinely tried to change. Panama, for its part, struggled to rehabilitate its image, balancing national pride with international scorn. Some banks began to overhaul their onboarding processes. Know your customer became more than a formality. Trusts and foundations were scrutinized. Suspicious patterns, once ignored, were flagged. But for all the motion, much remained still. The wealthiest clients simply moved sideways, from Panama to the British Virgin Islands, from there to Delaware or Singapore. The industry adjusted, as it always had, adapting to regulation with new interpretations, fresh terminology, and slightly more polished facades. Loss, it seemed, had limits, and those who lost most were not those named in the leak, but those who continued living in a system tilted quietly away from them. Still, something subtle began to shift in the public mind. A slow, steady redefinition of legitimacy. It was no longer enough for an action to be legal. People began to ask, is it right? And that question, once released, does not return easily to its cage. Universities began teaching the leak as a case study. Ethics courses examined the grey areas between legality and harm. Whistleblower protections, though patchy, became a subject of debate. And the public began to recognize the difference between tax evasion, a crime, and tax avoidance, a choice, often aided by the same institutions tasked with upholding financial order. In time, a new generation came of age, having seen early on that wealth could be shielded not only by law, but by opacity. For them, the papers were not a scandal. They were a mirror. In that mirror, they saw governments asking the poor for more, while the powerful sent their money elsewhere. They saw infrastructure crumbling, healthcare underfunded, schools neglected, while yachts and mansions multiplied far beyond their borders. They saw how public sacrifice was matched by private escape. And they began to ask, if this is how the world works, why should we play by its rules? That is the haunting legacy. Not chaos, but erosion. Erosion of compliance, erosion of faith, erosion of the unspoken contract that binds citizens to the state. Because systems do not collapse when people rebel. They collapse when people disconnect. And so the aftermath of the Panama Papers has been defined not by revolution, but by quiet exits, of belief, of engagement, of patience. A growing segment of the population in many nations has begun to disengage from the stories that once held democratic society together. It is no longer shocking to learn that wealth lives behind curtains. It is expected, and when exposure becomes expectation, the power of truth diminishes. This is what those who seek change now contend with. Not outrage, but fatigue. Not disbelief, but resignation. Still, the flame has not gone out. There are those, lawyers, legislators, accountants, teachers, whistleblowers, who saw the leak not as a moment of defeat, but as a roadmap for resistance. They understood that the offshore system, though vast, is made of choices. And choices can change. New efforts have risen to create global standards for transparency. Investigative collectives have grown stronger, more decentralized, less vulnerable. Technology has made data harder to bury, and some citizens, inspired not by scandal, but by clarity, have demanded more from those who claim to serve them. The Panama Papers did not end the system, but they weakened its cloak. They revealed not just how the world works, but how it might work differently, if enough people, in enough places, chose to care. And so the legacy is not written in law alone. It is written in memory, in every voter who asks a better question, in every student who learns to follow the money, in every journalist who refuses to look away, in every official who chooses principle over profit. That is, the slow revolution. The one that happens not in protests or prosecutions, but in the long, quiet arc of understanding. But beneath the shifting policies and token reforms, something more delicate stirred. In classrooms and workshops tucked away from the centers of power, the story of the Panama Papers began to be told in a new way. Not as scandal, but as instruction. Professors in law schools unspooled the details not to provoke outrage, but to cultivate awareness, to make visible the invisible. Young lawyers, future analysts, and budding investigators were taught not just the mechanics of offshore systems, but the moral and structural questions they raise. Who benefits from invisibility? What is the price of secrecy, and who pays it? The papers became a text, and the world began, however slowly, to read it more carefully. In some cities, artists turned to the documents not as evidence, but as metaphor. Exhibitions opened quietly in Berlin, London, and Buenos Aires, where fragments of real documents were woven into installations, music, and performance. Visitors walked through spaces filled with photocopied ledgers and redacted names, while whispered recordings played overhead. Voices in many languages reciting the names of places that had once seemed distant and abstract. Seychelles, Belize, the British Virgin Islands. In these curated spaces, the papers were reinterpreted as stories not just of greed, but of erasure. Wealth was not simply hidden. It had been withdrawn from the human story. This effort to humanize the abstract continued in the work of local journalists. Even after the initial wave of reporting had subsided, many continued tracing the ripple effects. Some focused on the land deals that had been financed with offshore funds. Others uncovered how public contracts were awarded to shell companies with political ties. What the leak had begun, persistent journalism extended, and over time, the global map of financial secrecy began to take on sharper dimensions. It was no longer just about the Caribbean or Pacific Islands. Secrecy had addresses in European capitals, in US states, in major financial districts. The idea that corruption was over there began to dissolve. Still, this widening lens brought new discomfort. Citizens in wealthy countries who had long believed in the strength of their institutions were forced to reconsider the neutrality of their own systems. Swiss banks, Delaware corporations, London LLPs. These were not marginal players. They were central pillars in the same architecture the Panama Papers had exposed. And while some politicians called for transparency, others quietly protected the status quo. Reform was not a tidal wave, but a series of hesitant footsteps. One forward, another sideways, occasionally backward. In this tension, a curious duality emerged. On one hand, the leak had illuminated the fragility of global regulation, the porousness of international law, and the willingness of elites to insulate themselves from consequence. On the other, it had empowered the ordinary. The journalist in Nairobi who demanded clarity, the student in São Paulo who questioned her country's tax code, the civil servant in Bratislava who hesitated before rubber stamping a contract. Small pauses, small choices, but multiplied by thousands. These were the quiet legacies the papers left behind. Meanwhile, the digital tools born in the wake of the leak continued to evolve. Open-source investigators began mapping complex ownership structures with new software, transforming spreadsheets into visual constellations of power. Shell companies, once names on a page, became nodes in glowing networks. The distance between name and consequence grew thinner. Public datasets expanded, bolstered by new leaks and court records. Even the language began to shift. Beneficial ownership and jurisdictional arbitrage entered public discourse. Not everywhere, not immediately, but increasingly. Still, for every step forward, there were those who adapted faster. Financial engineers designed new layers of complexity. Trusts were subdivided. Nominee structures grew more intricate, and some jurisdictions, eager for business, doubled down on secrecy. They offered anonymity as a service, wrapped in legality, marketed not as evasion, but as asset protection. The more transparency was pursued in one part of the world, the more it was monetized in another. This global seesaw of secrecy and exposure underscored a deeper truth, that the system was not broken. It was working exactly as intended, designed to move capital swiftly, shield ownership, and protect the private interests of the few. The Panama Papers hadn't revealed flaws, they had revealed design. This was perhaps the hardest truth to accept, and yet it was one of the most important. Among whistleblowers and data journalists, there was a growing understanding that no single leak would be enough. The machine was too large, too deeply wired into the global economy. What would be needed instead was a culture of vigilance, an ecosystem of accountability built slowly, piece by piece. In some countries, this meant strengthening freedom of information laws. In others, it meant protecting journalists from state retaliation. In many places, it meant simply keeping the conversation alive. That conversation, though quieter now, never quite stopped. It appeared in academic conferences, in international watchdog reports, in late-night parliamentary sessions, where amendments were debated in sterile rooms beneath fluorescent lights. It was slow work. It lacked the drama of a leak, but it mattered. Because in the space between scandal and silence, between revelation and reform, lies the real work of change. Time passed. Years turned over quietly, yet the ripple of the Panama Papers continued its slow, deliberate course through the layers of global society. Though the initial shock had faded, its residue endured, not in shouts, but in murmurs, not in explosions, but in subtle shifts. This was the nature of legacy in the modern world, not a statue in a square, but a set of quiet changes shaping the way people speak, act, and expect. In this final chapter, we explore how the revelations of 2016 reverberate today. In systems still under strain, in laws still being written, in debates still simmering beneath the surface of politics and finance. To trace modern connections is to step gently through a landscape of echoes. In 2021, a new leak emerged, the Panama Papers, larger than the Panama Papers in sheer size and scope. More than 600 journalists from around the world worked together to comb through nearly 12 million documents, many of which linked directly back to the same shadow economy first illuminated in Panama. Yet, without the original breach, this new one may never have found its footing. The networks, methods, and even some of the same names reappeared. The world now had a vocabulary for it: trusts, nominees, layered incorporations, beneficial ownership. The lessons of the Panama Papers had not vanished. They had taken root. In that way, the papers became a reference point, an origin story for a new era of investigative journalism. Each new exposé cited it. Every new whistleblower had it in mind. Its presence was quiet but permanent, like a watermark. Governments, too, responded in new tones. In the United States, the Corporate Transparency Act was passed in 2021, requiring businesses to report their real owners to the Department of the Treasury. It marked a slow but significant departure from decades of permissiveness. Elsewhere, the European Union continued to refine its anti-money laundering directives, slowly tightening requirements on shell entities and increasing oversight of financial flows. The term beneficial ownership was no longer whispered in legal briefings. It was now debated on the floors of parliaments and recorded in public registers. But perhaps the most profound shift was not legal. It was emotional. Before the Panama Papers, secrecy was abstract, a distant concept, assumed to be the domain of intelligence agencies and large-scale espionage. After the leak, it became personal. People began to recognize the ways secrecy shaped everyday life, in crumbling roads, in overwhelmed hospitals, in underfunded schools. They saw the connection between offshore wealth and onshore poverty. This is the modern connection, understanding that when wealth hides, everyone else pays. As nations strained under rising debts and shrinking budgets, the public began to ask deeper questions about fairness, not just in terms of tax rates, but of civic responsibility. What does it mean to belong to a nation, to benefit from its protections, while evading its obligations? These were no longer theoretical discussions. They became part of election campaigns, part of civil society discourse. Political candidates were asked not just about spending, but about transparency. Proposals for wealth taxes, digital registries, and global minimum tax agreements began to gain traction. The OECD's campaign for global tax reform, culminating in a proposal for a global minimum corporate tax rate, was born in part from the sentiment exposed by the Panama Papers, that large borderless firms could not continue extracting profits while sidestepping obligations. Corporations responded, often with careful messaging. Some pledged greater transparency. Others issued statements reaffirming their commitment to ethical tax conduct. A few, caught flat-footed, restructured altogether, relocating their headquarters, or simplifying their corporate trees. But beneath the surface, the old strategies endured. In interviews, some tax attorneys quietly admitted that the industry had not shrunk. It had simply evolved. Secrecy had moved to new domains. Wealth was no longer hidden only in Caribbean islands. It now lived in trusts registered in South Dakota, in holding companies based in the UAE, in art bought with crypto, in real estate wrapped in LLCs. And in the digital age, a new complexity had emerged. Anonymity no longer required foreign jurisdictions. It could be achieved within familiar borders, using legal vehicles crafted to deflect scrutiny. The tools had changed, but the game remained. That realization has sparked a new wave of attention toward domestic secrecy. In the United States, attention turned inward, to states like Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming, long known for their business-friendly incorporation laws. These states, though not offshore in geography, had long functioned as de facto havens. And in the United Kingdom, criticism grew over the use of Scottish limited partnerships and property purchases by anonymous foreign buyers. Luxury flats sat empty while housing shortages deepened. The connection became clear. When wealth evades daylight, entire cities change. Meanwhile, citizens have become quietly more aware. Not everyone took to the streets, but people began to follow the money. They began to wonder why familiar problems persisted despite immense national wealth. And some of them began to understand that the issue wasn't just scarcity, it was misallocation. In schools and universities, students now study the Panama Papers as part of curriculum. In podcasts and quiet documentaries, the story is retold. Not with anger, but with reflection. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. A gentle revolution driven not by rage, but by recognition. Even in pop culture, the language of secrecy has crept in. TV shows dramatize the lives of billionaires with offshore secrets. Films reference shell companies and numbered accounts. These themes are no longer exotic, they are part of the collective narrative. In this way, the legacy continues. Whistleblowers, too, are no longer nameless anomalies. They are seen, increasingly, as participants in a moral conversation. Protected in some nations, hunted in others. But always central to the unfolding story of transparency. Their role has changed, from rogue actors to reluctant witnesses of the systems in which they worked. And as technology advances, with blockchain records, open-source databases, and AI-assisted investigations, secrecy becomes harder to maintain. The tools that once protected the powerful are now being repurposed to expose them. Modern connections are fragile things. They do not shake the earth, but they guide it. The Panama Papers did not end corruption, but they mapped its roots. They did not destroy secrecy, but they made it visible. And in doing so, they changed what future truth-tellers could do. As the digital world expanded, it did not leave the offshore world behind. Instead, the two grew together, intertwined in quiet complexity. Cryptocurrency, digital assets, decentralized finance. These did not replace traditional wealth structures. They added new layers to them. In the years since the Panama Papers, the very concept of secrecy began to evolve. It was no longer defined only by islands and foreign incorporations. It was defined by encryption, by obfuscation, by regulatory arbitrage, where the rich and well-advised shifted not just money, but data across jurisdictions faster than any authority could track. Where once a law firm in Panama had to draw up papers, now a line of code or a new blockchain protocol could serve the same purpose. But with each new technology came new scrutiny. Investigative journalists, inspired by the leak of 2016, began turning their attention to the blockchain, to wallets, exchanges, and DAOs. And though the rhetoric of crypto promised transparency, the reality was often far less visible. Money moved in patterns, but the names behind those patterns remained hidden. Still, the impulse to follow remained, to trace, to question, to illuminate. In that way, the Panama Papers served as more than a singular scandal. They became a lens, a way of seeing the world. Universities, policy think tanks, non-profit organizations, many of them began building entire frameworks around financial transparency. Scholars who once studied corruption in theory now had thousands of real-life documents to draw upon. And in some corners of the world, civil society grew stronger. In Kenya, activists traced shell companies linked to foreign land deals. In the Philippines, researchers examined offshore accounts tied to historical dictatorships. In Brazil, new transparency initiatives were launched, influenced by past exposures and future possibilities. Even small leaks, those that might have gone unnoticed before, were now compared to the standard set in 2016. The Panama Papers had quietly redefined the threshold. There is a peculiar kind of power in shaping what is considered normal. The papers did this not by shocking the world once, but by changing what the world considered tolerable. Before 2016, the phrase tax haven belonged to economic textbooks. After, it became a point of everyday conversation. Before, beneficial ownership was technical jargon. After, it became a political talking point. Before, offshore was distant. After, it was close, personal, real. That is the legacy that continues into the modern era. A shift in baseline. A raising of expectations. A soft, persistent question in the background of every major financial news story. Who really owns this? Governments still wrestle with answers. Some have improved their disclosure laws. Others resist. A few have moved in the opposite direction, doubling down on opacity in the name of business efficiency or financial competitiveness. But the illusion has broken. The public now understands that secrecy is not a neutral tool. It is a weapon, depending on who wields it. And once a weapon is recognized, it cannot be unseen. In this, the legacy of the Panama Papers continues to haunt the institutions that once thrived in silence. Trust in international financial institutions has weakened. Surveys show that belief in fairness, in taxation, in opportunity, in justice, has eroded steadily since the mid-2010s. The leak was not the cause, but it was a catalyst, a revealing spark. Activists now cite it in campaigns for fair taxation. Policy advocates reference it in legislative proposals. Academics build models around it. Students debate its implications in ethics classes. It has become a part of the shared archive of the 21st century. One curious trend that has emerged is how the private sector has also responded, not only with defensiveness, but with absorption. Several law firms and consultancies now advertise reputation risk services, offering clients not just tax advice, but public image protection. Some PR firms quietly train executives to handle questions about offshore exposure. Others specialize in managing online footprints in the wake of leaks. The industry, in other words, has adapted. It always does, but it now does so in a world more awake. A world that, while not transformed, is no longer asleep. The next generation of journalists, policymakers, lawyers, they were young when the Panama Papers were first revealed. But they grew up knowing that secrets do not stay buried forever. That one leak can shift the ground beneath powerful feet. That awareness is part of the modern connection. A knowledge passed quietly, like a whisper, from story to story, from leak to leak. And in boardrooms, that whisper lingers. It reminds executives, bankers, and consultants that privacy is no longer absolute, that reputations are no longer invincible, that the architecture of avoidance is only as strong as its weakest server. And so, even among the world's elite, the mood has changed. Not in open confession, but in caution. Do we need that company? Should we restructure before the new regulation takes effect? Let's revisit our compliance policy. Let's make sure this wouldn't look bad in a leak. These are the new rituals of secrecy. Less arrogance, more insurance. Less invincibility, more caution. It is not justice, but it is something. In that slow movement, in those internal dialogues, the Panama Papers live on. Today, long after the first stories ran and the first websites crashed under traffic, the data still rests online. Archived, searchable, downloadable. Students still study it. Regulators still cite it. Activists still draw from its revelations. And though the world has not ended secrecy, it has named it. That is a beginning. In the quiet years that followed the Panama Papers eruption, something else began to take shape. Not in the headlines, but in the layers underneath. The leak had rippled outward, but its echo had also turned inward, settling into the unspoken behaviors of governments, corporations, and individuals. While the initial aftermath focused on prosecution and public shame, the longer legacy unfolded slowly through shifting digital infrastructures, altered political alliances, and changing narratives about wealth itself. In a world still adjusting to transparency as a threat rather than a virtue, some governments reacted with hardened subtlety, not by denying the facts, but by diluting them. Public registries were proposed, but the definitions of beneficial ownership became looser. Anti-money laundering reforms were passed, but enforcement budgets remained meager. Global summits praised progress, while quietly carving out exceptions for their own strategic industries. The dance between exposure and evasion became more refined, a choreography of public gestures and private preservation. Meanwhile, in boardrooms of multinational corporations and the offices of the ultra-wealthy, a different calculation emerged. The Panama Papers had introduced a variable into the equation of wealth management: risk of visibility. In response, strategies became more dispersed. Structures were relocated across jurisdictions like shifting sands. Advisors emphasized redundancy, multiple shells, layered trusts, nominee directors in places with no extradition. The complexity became its own form of camouflage. If you couldn't be invisible, you could at least be unreadable. But even as the elite fortified their financial defenses, something had quietly shifted in the public's imagination. The very idea of offshore finance had changed. Where it was once viewed as the domain of savvy entrepreneurs and multinational efficiencies, it had become synonymous with betrayal, of public trust, of national economies, of democratic values. In many countries, new political movements emerged that made transparency central to their platforms. Not always successfully, but the vocabulary had changed. In Latin America, where several high-profile figures had been named in the leaks, civil society became more insistent. NGOs launched their own investigations. University researchers combed through corporate registries. Young journalists, many of whom had entered the profession inspired by the Panama Papers, created collaborative outlets designed to withstand legal retaliation. Some of these reporters worked from spare rooms with weak Wi-Fi and little institutional backing. And yet, they published. Their stories were quiet forms of resistance, ones that refused to let the subject fade into abstraction. On the African continent, where the impact of capital flight is perhaps most acutely felt, the papers were a bitter reminder of extraction in modern form. Countries rich in minerals and natural resources saw the wealth pulled away not in ships, but in contracts and spreadsheets. Transparency advocates from Ghana to South Africa used the revelations to challenge sweetheart deals, expose the financial misdirection in state-run enterprises, and demand reform from international lenders. They found that the leak had given them a new vocabulary with which to speak to power, a way to explain how something invisible could still have weight. At the same time, the financial world began to intersect with newer technologies that promised both promise and peril. Cryptocurrency platforms offered a new means of storing value, outside the reach of traditional banks, outside the old offshore havens. For some, this represented freedom. For others, a new frontier of concealment. Blockchain-based asset transfers, decentralized exchanges, anonymous wallets. These tools echoed with both the idealism of digital autonomy and and the murmur of regulatory concern. The same questions emerged: who owns what, and why can't we see them? In the United States, where the leak triggered fewer direct consequences than abroad, the cultural shift was slower, but not absent. Whistleblower protections entered mainstream debate. Corporate transparency became a fixture in shareholder resolutions. Journalists investigated real estate empires in places like New York and Miami, revealing how luxury property had quietly become a vehicle for anonymous capital. Although the names from Panama didn't often appear on US soil, the practices did. And in Europe, a complex drama unfolded around the very idea of openness. The European Union, initially a vocal supporter of transparency reforms, began to feel the pushback from its own members. Banks in Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg lobbied for balanced regulation. Some courts ruled that full public access to beneficial ownership data violated privacy rights. Transparency advocates were caught between two moral imperatives: the right to know and the right to be forgotten. It became clear that even in liberal democracies, secrecy could wear many robes. Still, beneath all this, beneath the spreadsheets and the shell companies, the legislation and the lawsuits, there remained a deeper current. The Panama Papers had done more than just identify misconduct. They had offered a glimpse into a different kind of power. The power to exist without trace, to accumulate without scrutiny, to shape the world while remaining unseen. And in doing so, they revealed just how far the modern world had strayed from the principles it publicly claimed. Because this wasn't just about money, it was about design. A system that permits such vast concealment isn't an accident. It is a reflection of who has influence and how they use it. It reveals whose voices matter in policy making, whose priorities get embedded in trade agreements, whose legal frameworks are adopted across borders. The offshore world is not a fringe. It is the infrastructure of global capital. And the papers pulled back that curtain. Yet perhaps the most enduring transformation was not in systems, but in people. The anonymous source who leaked the documents, still unnamed, still in hiding, remains one of the great mysteries of our time. Their motivations, as expressed in rare statements, pointed not to vengeance, but to justice. They spoke of inequality, of impunity, of a system so lopsided that even the exposure of its innermost workings might not be enough. And they were right. The leak did not bring collapse, but it did bring clarity. That clarity became a tool. For some, it sharpened activism. For others, it steeled resolve. For many, it served as quiet confirmation of what they had long suspected, but never had the means to prove: that the distance between rich and poor was not merely one of fortune, but of visibility. The rich had the tools to vanish, to reappear elsewhere, to shield their gains behind layers of legality. The poor had none of that. And so, the Panama Papers became more than a revelation. They became a reference point, a permanent reminder that hidden wealth is not just a technical issue, it is a moral one. That the decisions made in law firms and bank towers ripple out into classrooms, hospitals, and broken streets. That there is no such thing as victimless evasion. In time, the papers would be taught not just in journalism schools, but in ethics courses, political science programs, and international law curricula. They would appear in textbooks and footnotes. They would be cited in parliamentary debates and featured in global indexes of press freedom. Their story would enter the bloodstream of global awareness, not as a solved case, but as an ongoing question. A question that still waits in the quiet of spreadsheets and sealed files. What happens next, it seems, depends not just on what we find, but on what we're willing to see. In our closing reflection, we will step back from the details, from the jurisdictions and the charts and the names. We will sit quietly with what it all means, what it means to know, what it means to see, and what it means to carry truth, gently, into a world still finding the courage to change. Long ago, truth was carried by travelers. Stories passed from voice to voice. Traders and monks, exiles and wanderers, they whispered the hidden ways of the world. They taught that not all maps were drawn in ink, and not all wealth rested in stone or coin. Today, the whisper is digital. It pulses in servers, in spreadsheets, in quiet leaks and anonymous uploads. But its message is much the same. What is hidden will one day seek the light. The Panama Papers were not a perfect moment. They were not a revolution, nor a reckoning complete in itself. They were a pause, a quiet breath drawn in the middle of the noise, reminding us how much we do not see and how much still rests in shadow. And yet, they mattered. Not because the entire system crumbled. It didn't. Not because all the names were punished. They weren't. But because they showed, for the first time in such scale, the scaffolding that supports a world of imbalance. Behind the mansions and luxury yachts. Behind the vacant skyscrapers in foreign cities. Behind the rising price of homes, the shrinking public services, the unequal access to dignity. There lies a structure, built not with laws alone, but with loopholes, protected not just by power, but by silence. The Panama Papers tore a small, deliberate hole in that silence. They asked no one to riot, they summoned no armies, but they asked something harder, that we pay attention, that we trace the threads of consequence from tax havens to daily life, that we stop accepting legal as the highest moral standard. And in some places, people did. Some turned their attention to reform. Others turned inward, re-evaluating their profession, their practice, their price. A few walked away from the game altogether. In schools, the story became a lesson. In parliaments, it became a warning. In documentaries like this one, it became a mirror, held gently to a world that so often resists looking at itself. We must remember, secrecy is not a crime in itself, but it is the soil in which many crimes take root. It is the shade that allows rot to grow unnoticed, and so, even now, the pursuit of transparency continues, not as a battle, but as a long, slow walk. Through legislation, through education, through conversation around dinner tables and in boardrooms alike. Sometimes the walk feels endless, and sometimes it feels lonely. But it is not fruitless. Every register published, every whistleblower is protected, every child who grows up knowing that justice is not naive. These are victories. Quiet ones, but victories nonetheless. The Panama Papers remind us that the world is not governed by laws alone, but by what we allow, what we ignore, and what we refuse to name. By choosing a name, we begin to reclaim. And that is what history teaches us, again and again. That change rarely begins with noise. It begins with a question, with a document opened by tired eyes, with a voice saying, "Did you see this?" With a conversation, long, slow, uncertain, that refuses to end in despair. In this story, the heroes are not warriors. They are researchers, archivists, editors working late, programmers securing data, ordinary people making extraordinary choices. And that, perhaps, is the most radical truth of all. That in a world rigged to serve the hidden, the act of uncovering, gently, truthfully, is an act of resistance. So if you leave this story with anything, let it be this: that the world can be known, that secrets lose power when seen, and that even in the age of billion-dollar concealment, truth still travels, soft-footed and patient, looking for eyes ready to receive it. May you be one of them, and may the next whisper find you awake. If you found this journey meaningful, consider subscribing to Uncharted Fragments. Here, we uncover forgotten truths, explore hidden histories, and let the quiet voices of the past speak once more. Each story is a candle in the dark, and there are many more to light. Rest well, learn deeply, and when you're ready, join us again for another forgotten fragment of our world.